In this video, we're going to go over the psychodynamic perspectives and how they say we form our personality. As usual, when talking about the psychodynamic perspective, we have to talk about Freud, right? As he is the one who founded psychoanalysis. Okay, so if you remember, he focuses all of the reasons for our behavior as influences from our childhood, influences from our unconscious, right? And how we deal with anxiety, right? Those defense mechanisms as a way to explain both our personality, our motivation, and then also psychological disorders, okay? Now, when he talks about the personality, he divides our personalities into three different sections, three different components, okay? The first one is the id, right? So the id is our instinctive motivation, right? So it focuses on the pleasure principle, where we want immediate gratification of whatever it is that we want. What we want, we need to get right now. Okay, so he claimed that we are born with our id, right? So think of babies, they cry when they're hungry, cry when they want to sleep, cry when they need to change, right? And they don't stop crying until they get what they want. So it's immediate gratification. He then believed that we develop our ego. So the ego is your decision-making part of your personality. So this runs under the reality principle, where you know that you sometimes have to delay gratification because it's not realistic for you to get everything that you want as soon as you want it. Okay, so this uses rational problem solving, and it tries to avoid negative social consequences, right? We try to do things that we know society will approve of. Okay, the last thing that we develop, according to Freud, is our superego. Okay, so this is like your conscious, right? Your moral compass that tells you right from wrong. Okay, so this is where we get our feelings of guilt. If you remember, Freud also divided up our levels of awareness into three components. The first is the conscious, right? What you are aware of at any given moment, right? What you are constantly or currently paying attention to. Your preconscious are things that you could be aware of but aren't currently paying attention to. So for example, your memories, right? Someone can ask you like, oh, when's your birthday? That's a memory. You can call that up into your conscious and tell them when your birthday is, but you're not constantly thinking about your birthday. Now, the unconscious is something that we cannot actually, pay attention to, be aware of, right? So these are all the thoughts, memories, and desires that influence our behavior, but we have no control over, okay? So Freud then believed that our behavior is a result of this internal conflict between the id, the ego, and the superego, right? Do I get what I want right now? Do I do what's right or wrong? Okay, so this is what he considered regular conflict, right? We deal with this every single day, so this is normal conflict. He also believed that there's a greater conflict when dealing with sex and aggression, right? So these things tend to have what he calls stricter social control, right? So some things are seen as acceptable, some things are seen as unacceptable, so it's not a very consistent norm that we can follow, and it's harder to then acceptably fulfill these drives. Okay, so then that causes a lot of internal conflict that we then have to deal with. So we use the metaphor of an iceberg to try to explain these levels of consciousness and the different parts of your personality. So the tip of an iceberg, the top part of the iceberg that's above the water, is actually only about 10% of the total iceberg. A majority of the ice is actually below the surface, right, below the water. So your conscious, right, the small part of your awareness is above the water, right? The things that you are aware of, things that you could see, right? Your pre-conscious is just below the surface, right? It's like when you're standing at the edge of a lake and you can see the fish that are near the edge of the lake towards the top of the water, but when they swim farther away and deeper into the lake, you can't see them anymore, right? So that would be your unconscious. If it's out of sight, it's out of mind. You're not thinking about it, okay? So the ego and superego work on all three levels, right? Because they deal with the reality principle, with your morality, okay? While the id is completely unconscious, right? Because these are all those drives that affect our behavior. Now, all this conflict creates anxiety, right? And so in order to deal with this anxiety, Freud believed that we use what he calls defense mechanisms, right? So these are unhealthy ways of dealing with our anxiety, right? Instead of actually dealing with what's causing our anxiety, we use defense mechanisms to avoid and protect ourselves from the anxiety. the first defense mechanism is probably something you guys have heard of before. I mean, we've definitely talked about it before, which is repression, right? So this is where you push thoughts or desires, anything that you find unacceptable or is causing you anxiety, down into your unconscious so that you don't think about it, because if you don't think about it, it doesn't cause you any anxiety. Projection is when you have bad behaviors or bad thoughts, bad feelings, and instead of coming to terms with the fact that you are the one doing the wrong stuff, you project it, right? You put those thoughts, feelings, behaviors onto someone else. So for example, if someone calls you out for being, a gossip, a trash talker about other people, that you're always in other people's business, right? Talking about things that don't have to do with you, then you would claim that that person is the one who's actually gossiping. You would say like, well, you're the one who's always talking to me about other people's stuff, right? I'm not the gossip, you are, right? So you're projecting it, you're putting it onto someone else so that you don't have to deal with the fact that you're the one with the bad behavior. Displacement is similar, except it's more specific about anger, right? So when a situation or a person, right, when something upsets you, instead of dealing with that person or with that situation, you take that anger and you place it on a non-threatening subject. So like a younger sibling, right? You break a plate, you punch a wall, right? So you're taking that anger out on something that doesn't have to do with whatever made you angry in the first place, right? So you're placing that anger in the wrong place. Now, reaction formation is just acting fake, right? You act the opposite of how you actually feel. So if there's a person that everybody absolutely loves and you cannot stand them, right? Instead of just being upfront and being like, I don't like you, you tell that person like, hey, bestie, what's up? Let's go get coffee. Let's hang out, right? Why would you hang out with someone you hate, right? So reaction formation, you act the opposite of what you actually feel. Regression is when you are in a stressful situation, right, when you're very anxious, you turn back to behaviors from an earlier stage that used to make you feel comfortable, right? So let's say someone has a really long, really hard day at work, right? They're very stressed. So they go home, they take a nap, and they start sucking their thumb, right? So something that's very childish, okay? Rationalization is basically coming up with an excuse for your bad behavior, right? So, for example, when you cheat on a test, right, you say, well, if I hadn't cheated, I was going to fail anyway, so I need to make sure that I pass this test. Otherwise, my parents are going to get me in trouble, so I had to cheat. Like, I didn't have any other option. And I'm sure a bunch of other people were cheating too, right? So it's not that big a deal that I cheated, right? So you're just coming up with an excuse to make you feel better. Now, identification is when specifically you have low self-esteem and there's a group that you admire that you think has good qualities, so then you try to join that group because then you believe if you're in that group, you also have the good qualities that you admire about them, right? So then you make yourself feel better if you're part of a certain group that you look up to. Now, sublimation is when you have unacceptable thoughts or drives, right? And you find an activity that society sees as acceptable in order to fulfill those drives, right? So for example, someone who's very aggressive, who just wants to beat people up on the street, right? That is unacceptable. That is assault, right? But instead, what they do is they join a boxing club where they get to beat people up for sport, right? It's okay to beat someone up in a boxing ring. I'm sure there's rules, right? I don't know them, but it's okay when you beat someone up there and mess up their face versus when you do it out on the street, right? So you take that unacceptable behavior and you channel it into an activity that society sees as acceptable. Similar to the developmental stages we talked about back in chapter 11, right? Freud came up with his own psychosexual stages of development, where in each stage there is a certain task or challenge that you need to deal with, right? And if you don't deal with it correctly, you end up with a fixation, right? So then you end up with a behavior that continues throughout your entire life, right? You're kind of stuck in that stage, okay? So he believed that our personality is established by the time that we are 5 years old. So we'll see that in the chart on the next slide, right? So then in each stage, you have sexual urges that you need to deal with, right? Because society doesn't deem sex as like an appropriate thing, right? That's not the norm. It's still seen as something that's taboo, right? So you have to figure that out. Now, Freud believed that any physical pleasure is sexual, right? So if you feel good when you're eating a cookie, he considers that sexual pleasure, right? Weird guy, but just so that we can put it into context, right? So then on the next slide, we're going to look at the chart and then all the different fixations that can happen when you don't successfully go through a stage. So the first stage is the oral stage. So this is from birth to age 1, right? So the key thing that you need to do in this stage is weaning. So going from drinking milk to eating solid foods, right? So the erotic focus then is on the mouth, right? So if your parents wean you too early, they try to get you started on solid food too early, or they wait too long to wean you, right? Because this is out of your control, you then have an oral fixation, right? So this can manifest itself then in smoking, gum chewing, nail biting, right? People who like to chew on pens and pencils, right? Anything that has to do with the mouth, right? And inappropriate, in a sense, behavior with the mouth, okay? Now, and the next stage is the anal stage from ages 2 to 3. So the focus is on your anus because it has to do with toilet training. Now, again, if your parents try to toilet train you too early and you constantly have accidents, you're going to get in trouble, right? They're going to punish you. Or that's usually the case. But if they try it too late, that's also going to cause problems. So the fixation then is being anal, right? So you're either anal retentive, which means that you are very organized because you can't have control over your bowels. You have to have control over every other aspect in your life. Or you're anal explosive, which would be the opposite. Because you know you can't control your bowels, you're like, why would I control anything else? So they're very messy, disorganized, and things like that. Now, the next stage is the phallic stage, so ages 4 to 5, right? This is around the time where Freud believes that our personality is pretty much finishing being established, right? So the erotic focus is on the genitals, and the key task is identifying, right, you're either a male or female, and then which of your parents do you identify with, right? And then this causes, according to Freud, an Oedipal or Electra crisis. So an Oedipal crisis is when a boy is upset with his father because he wants all of his mom's attention, and the father is also getting mom's attention. So it's like a competition, right? The same thing with the Electra crisis. Girls are jealous of their mothers because they want their father's attention, but dad is also paying attention to mom, okay? So they basically have to deal with the fact that other people are going to get attention, right? That they're not the center of attention. If they can't deal with that, then the fixation is on vanity and pride, right? Where they become self-absorbed, right? Egocentric people. Okay. The next stage is the latency stage. So this is around ages 6 until 12. There's no focus here, right? There's nothing really happening here. This is just where kids start making friends with other kids, right? According to Freud. And then the last stage is the genital stage. So this is once you go through puberty, right? The erotic focus is the genitals because the key task is then having intimate relationships with other people. Carl Jung worked with and was similar in his ideas as Freud, but he went in a slightly different direction, right? So he proposed that the unconscious actually has 2 layers, right? So you have one regular conscious level, things you're aware of, and then you have 2 levels of the unconscious. The first is the personal unconscious, right? Things that we put into our unconscious, things that affect our behavior that have to do specifically with us. And then a collective unconscious, which is all the memories from our ancestors that all of humanity shares, right? Every single person is connected by this collective unconscious, right? So Jung believed that this is how we're able to explain why archetypes exist, right? These things, these images and ideas that have universal meaning, right? So this could explain why most cultures, right, even from early history, have creation myths, right? They have gods for, the sun and the weather and things like that. Even though they may have different names, right, they are all very similar to each other without having had contact with each other, right? That's the key thing, that they have similar ideas, but we know that they did not get those ideas from each other because there was no contact, no trade, right? Traditionally, which is how ideas have spread and do spread, right? So the collective unconscious is a way to explain that. So like, for example, why the Egyptians were building pyramids and then the Mayans were building pyramids, right, without having any contact with each other. He would explain that through the collective unconscious. He was also the first to describe introverts and extroverts as personality types. So that those ideas came from Carl Jung. So in this image we have, the visual of what it looks like of the 3 levels of conscious according to Jung, right? So you have the top layer, which is each person's own conscious. They have then under that their own personal unconscious, and then collectively they have the collective unconscious, right? That they're all connected by that. So this was a way to explain how mandalas show up in different cultures that have previously had no contact, right? So how is it that, they're making these circular, intricate shapes that have, cultural significance without having had contact with each other? Okay, so he would explain that, of course, with the collective unconscious, that they all got the idea from there. Alfred Adler came up with the idea of individual psychology, focusing around the idea of superiority, right? So according to Adler, the only reason that we do things, our motivation, is to be superior to other people, right? So this feeling of needing to be superior is what causes us to have growth, to learn skills, overcome challenges, right? To become better than others, okay? Now, when you feel inferior, you then have to compensate, right? So compensation would be us then trying to learn new skills, trying to be better, right? To again be superior, okay? When the feelings of inferiority are extreme, he believed we develop an inferiority complex, right? And he believed that this is tied back to your parenting as a child, right? So if your parents pampered and coddled you, did absolutely everything for you, right? You grew up not knowing how to do anything. So then you feel inadequate and inferior, right? And then the same thing happens for children who are neglected. Their parents don't provide them with anything, don't do anything for them, but they also don't teach them how to do anything either. So it's the same result, feeling inferior, feeling inadequate, right? So, and this is more than the average person, okay? So when you have an inferiority complex, you then go through overcompensation, right? Because you have a lot more to make up for than the average person. Okay, so they try to achieve high status, they try to have power over others, or they try to buy things to show other people how successful they are, right? Like having a boat, a fancy car. That depending on your birth order, that would have an influence on your personality. So for example, if you're an only child, you're more likely to be spoiled, right? You didn't learn how to share when you were little because you didn't have anyone to share with, but you're also seen as more mature because you were treated more like an adult. You hung around with adults more because at home you didn't have kids to hang out with and play with. Oldest children tend to become the parents of the younger siblings, right? They tend to take on that responsibility. Second children tend to be more competitive. They try to outshine the older sibling. Middle children tend to be kind of low-key, middle of the road, mind their own business. And youngest children tend to be the babies, spoiled, super competitive because they want all the attention. Now, not all children are going to fall into these categories, but most of us, for the most part, can relate to our position in this chart. Dynamic perspective. So the good things is that it brought about the idea that our unconscious does have an influence in our behavior, right? It can cause anxiety if there's conflict, right? With those, the id, ego, superego, right? Or when we're trying to avoid anxiety, we use defense mechanisms, and that our early childhood can also influence, our adult personality, especially if we have traumatic events that happen to us as we are younger. Now, the bad things are that, first of all, it's poor testability. Right, because it's not very scientific, you can't really study the unconscious, right? There's very little ability to collect data and then make comparisons between people. So then that leads to an unrepresentative sample. Most of Freud's information was based on a few case studies that he had with his patients, right? And so those case studies can't necessarily be generalized to an entire population. And he was also very sexist, right? He was very biased against women, so the psychodynamic perspective tends to have a very male-centered point of view, which again isn't very holistic and then can't generalize across all genders.